Madam President, Mrs. Rajavi, Safura, so expertly and with consummate presence, moderating our proceedings this afternoon, Mrs. Arisha Free, other colleagues, G, from whom we've just spoken, and another distinguished former Prime Minister from whom you will shortly hear. It is truly a privilege to be invited to be amongst your number today, and I should like to begin, perhaps prosaically and predictably, but I hope validly, by echoing what G just said to us about your contribution, which is special, which is indispensable, and which none of us fortunate to live in peace and freedom should ever take for granted or forget to acknowledge. It is an outstanding display of sacrifice that you and others are making, and you do so because of an unextinguishable belief that you have right on your side and that your cause needs to be championed, not just or principally for your own personal sakes, but for the liberation of and opportunities for the people whom you hold dear. So I want to celebrate that, and I don't think you should worry about applauding other people, but I think you should start by applauding yourselves. And I remember from my own experience over 2 decades in the House of Commons as a member, and indeed from my decade-long tenure as Speaker, as I referenced earlier in private conversation, the ubiquitous presence of the National Council of Resistance of Iran in and around Westminster. Literally, my friends, so that you can visualize the graphic significance of it, at the entrance to and the exit from the Palace of Westminster, not to mention in the central lobby of the House of Commons, there was a regular reminder of the moral passion of the cause of the resistance movement in Iran, with people whose daily job it was, almost, if you will, my friends, to buttonhole, yes, to touch the lapel of individual parliamentarians and to say, will you spare a moment to sign our petition, to hear our voice, to empathise with our cause. So it is a cause of which I've long been conscious. And if I cast my mind back, I remember in 1979-80, when I was still at school, and it was one of my formative political memories, the cacophony of international revulsion at and condemnation of the Shah, because there was much anger about that regime. But what I so quickly discovered was that one bestial and unaccountable regime can be succeeded by another bestial and accountable regime. And what matters is not the words people use, but the deeds they do. Even taken from our own European continent, I remember saying to my father when I was a very young man, indeed when I was a boy, and conscious of the Stalinist regime in East Germany as it then was, I said, "Dad, why is the GDR, the German Democratic Republic, so called?" To which my father rather cynically, but I think accurately replied, "Son, it's called the German Democratic Republic because it isn't." That was the point he wanted to convey to me. A bit like he used to say on a human level, "Son, the more often someone says to you, 'My word is my bond,' the faster you should run away." Because if somebody is really honest, he or she probably doesn't need to keep saying it. Look, I'm thrilled to be here to highlight your cause, to acknowledge the suffering of the people of Iran and to join forces with others in seeking to be, as best I can, a voice for freedom. I sometimes hear it said, perhaps not that often, but still more often than I would like, by people who live in circumstances both of freedom and of comfort, well, you shouldn't preoccupy yourself too much with the depredations and abuses of liberty in some parts of the world, John, because 'twas ever thus. It's always been that way, and people who haven't had freedom are not much bothered by it. I've never bought that argument, my friends. I've never bought that argument. Yes, for a period, of course, people can be downtrodden, becalmed, subdued, intimidated, wearisome at the accumulation of all their disadvantages, misfortunes, and iniquities. But my own fundamental belief has always been that human beings aspire to be free. And at whatever stage of development a country might be, individuals, communities, localities, states, regions, countries want to be autonomous. And very simply, I think if I understand you correctly, and it is a slogan, but it's an important one, a key slogan of yours is, down with the oppressor, be it the Shah dictatorship or that of the supreme leader. And I want, in the most voluble terms that I can deploy, to back your call for a secular and democratic republic, and indeed, Mrs. Rajavi, if I may, to support what I regard as your 10-point plan for the country's future. People's sovereignty, universal suffrage, pluralism, that is to say, the opportunity of democratic and political competition, not one person, one vote once, but genuine democracy, which is not a fact, but a process and a culture and a system and a mindset. Freedom of speech, freedom of parties, freedom of assembly, freedom of the media, and that must include freedom of the internet. Individual and social freedoms in accordance with the UN Declaration of Human Rights. No, in terms unmistakable which brook of no contradiction and allow for no exceptions. No to the use of the death penalty, which is just wrong so far, I confess, as I am concerned. The separation of religion and state and freedom of worship. I hope I will not cause umbrage or offence to anybody. I'm not a strongly religious person. I am myself of Jewish origin, but I'm ethnically Jewish and proud of it rather than religiously Jewish. I absolutely respect religious autonomy, but I can never forbear to make the point how many appalling evils and denials and abuses of humanity are committed in the name not of genuine religion, but of the perversion of religion. And that is what we've seen writ large on an industrial scale over the last 4 decades under this monstrous tyranny in Iran. So a separation of religion and state is crucial. Complete gender equality. You know, when I was speaker, I once went in front of an audience where there were some very traditional types, and I wanted to talk about the importance of gender equality, but also of gay equality, LGBT equality, and an official said to me, "Oh, Mr. Speaker, I would strongly advise you against dwelling on that theme. There are a number of people represented at the conference who will not be sympathetic to that point of view." And I said to him, "I'm afraid I'm not influenced by that. If you believe something, you should say it loudly and clearly, not just to those who already agree with you, but possibly even to those who don't. Otherwise, how do you make progress? How do you win hearts and minds?" And for what it's worth, and my colleagues will have their say, to me, a crucial part of a genuine small L liberal pluralistic democracy is not tolerance, but respect. Respect for everybody, irrespective of race, of colour, of creed, of religion, of disability, or indeed of sexual orientation. And that, I think, has got to be part of a positive, forward-looking, progressive, to be respected in the world in the future, Iranian nation. An independent judiciary and legal system, autonomy for the Iranian nationalities who shouldn't have to submit to some sort of centralized yoke, but should be entitled to express themselves, equal opportunities in employment and entrepreneurship, and protection of the environment. Crucially, a peaceful, non-nuclear Iran coexisting with others around the world and cooperating with them. But you can't erase or ignore the past. In order to plan the future, you've got to recognize what's happened. And that's why I agree with Amnesty that 1988 massacre must be investigated. We have to get to the bottom of the full grisly horrors of it. And Ebrahim Raisi must be investigated for crimes against humanity. The man is a disgrace to Iran. I can't help but feel that although it is common for bestial and abusive regimes to deploy a sotto voce voice as a foreign minister, a diplomatic sort of figure to try to mitigate the perceived excesses of his regime, the truth of the matter is really that reformers and hardliners don't seem to me to have much to choose between them. When the outgoing president signed thousands of death warrants, I don't quite see how he can be regarded as some sort of born-again moderate. Reformers, hardliners, the game is over, your tactics are sussed, and your enmity towards freedom is recognised around the world. A state sponsor of terrorism and an egregious abuser of human rights. Now, the nuclear issue has been focused on to a degree already, and I can't help but feel, without wanting to rehearse the detail of this, that democracies have to recognise that there is a key difference between dealing with other democracies on matters of genuine contention and dispute and dealing with countries whose regimes are not democracies. And when you are a democracy or a collection of democracies, a European Union of democracies, dealing with a non-democracy, you have to be a bit savvy about it and recognise when the go slow is being deployed and people are deliberately taking the mickey out of you while you seek to be genuine and to make progress, and they're just playing for time while building up an ever more threatening and explosive nuclear arsenal. And it does seem to me that that needs to change. All the evidence so far as I can see is that the conciliatory approach hasn't brokered any notable advance. The regime now is in its weakest position. It faces serious crisis at home, and this is at point at which to be firm and to send a clear message to the regime that if they do not abandon their nuclear weapons program, the suspended UN resolution will again be applied. That is the language that a totalitarian regime understands. It doesn't respect conciliation, it respects and even sometimes fears strength. It is utterly derisive towards and contemptuous of weakness. On human rights, the litany of examples is just so big. Just since the start of this year, 3 women aged 59, 62 and 69 were sentenced to 12 years in prison in total for supporting the People's Mujahideen Organization of Iran. 2 were sentenced to 5 years and another to 2 years. Their charge? Acting against the national security of the country, a suitably vague and indecipherable charge. And the premises, a large garden belonging to one of them, where they'd met, was also confiscated. In November last year, following days of sit-ins and large-scale protests, the regime's security forces attacked the farmers and local residents in Isfahan because those people were demanding their right that crisis. Now, the protest was initially against the water shortage, but it took on, understandably and inevitably when people are so long suffering, political overtones as the throngs of people began, legitimately and as is their right, to chant anti-regime slogans calling for the regime's overthrow. And the forces of oppression then did their dirty work against unarmed protesters. In February last year, there were protests in Sistan and Balochistan province in southeastern Iran, and there are examples galore. 357 people executed in 2021, markedly more than 100 greater than in 2020, and I animadverted to this point a few moments ago, but Hassan Rouhani ended his 8-year term with nearly 5,000 executions, including a very significant number of political prisoners. There are then what are called private murders, namely suspicious deaths, and this, of course, with different terminology, with a different lexicon used to describe it, is a feature of undemocratic regimes, of tyrannous and barbaric dictatorships in different parts of the world. We all know that in Russia, the common technique is to cause people to disappear and then to poison them. In other parts of the world, in some parts of Africa, people seem, if they are opponents of the regime, mysteriously to die in plane crashes or in road accidents. So I think we know what the game is here, and that game stinks. According to Iran HRM, at least 77 Iranians were murdered in 2021 as a result of arbitrary killings. So this is a phenomenon that goes on and on and on and on. And on the 1988 massacre, and the regime might not like it being mentioned, which is a good reason to keep mentioning it over and over and over again, we are talking about mass crimes against humanity. And as 7 UN experts put it in a letter published just over a year ago, the failure of international bodies to act has had a devastating impact on the survivors and families, as well as on the general situation of human rights in Iran. It has emboldened Iran to continue to conceal the fate of the victims and to maintain a strategy of deflection and denial that continues to date. We know of the cases of state terror. There are many examples with which I won't bore you now, because you will know them well, but they are persistent and they're part of a pattern, and they're a pattern that continues to be repeated. And only last year in April, the Swedish police arrested 2 people named Salma Kormai and Fuad Malakashahi on charges of planning a terrorist attack in the country. They presented themselves as Afghan nationals. The Swedish security service, SAPO, determined that their ages, nationalities, and even their names were false. Their real names were Fershteh Sanai Farid and Mehdi Ramazani, and they were Iranian citizens. Both have since been arrested on terror-related charges. Protests, and this is a huge tribute to the indefatigability, the stoicism, and the relentless quest for freedom of people in Iran, continue on a magnificent, and I use that word advisedly, continue on a magnificent scale. Protests by workers in their thousands, protests by teachers and educators, protests by retired people, protests by farmers, protests by high school students, and I want to celebrate those young people, part of civil society amongst our number in this room today or in audiences around the world, protests by physicians, protests by creditors, protests by ranchers, protests by nurses, protests by business people, protests by truck drivers, by chicken farmers, by taxi drivers, by engineers, by flood victims, by prisoners, and by others. And emblematic of, a common characteristic of these protests is people clashing with the regime's security forces. The presence of women and children in uprisings has been significant, and the amoral indifference and contempt of the security forces for the rights of those people says more about the regime than its enforcers appear ever to know. A significant number of these protests have been organised with calls on social media, and the opportunity, as well as some of the dangers of social media, is something we should bear in mind for those fighting valiantly for their freedom. And the demands of the various strata have gradually shifted from economic issues to slogans against the regime and its conduct. Though economic protests are understandable enough, because you can have a debate about nuclear weapons, and we've had such debates, of course, in the UK, and they've taken place elsewhere. But there is something particularly obnoxious, repellent, and disgusting about a country such as Iran, in which so many decent people do not really live, but eke out some paltry existence of the most minimal kind, while the state is expending vast sums of money that could better be dedicated to welfare of the people on weapons of mass destruction which they do not need and should not be allowed to retain. And of course, as we all know, last year's election and the nationwide boycott thereof were very revealing. The election was a sham. It wasn't democratic any more than some of the elections that I've had reason to note or observe in Burma or in Sudan or in Syria have in any sense really been democratic elections. Of course that wasn't the case. It was an absolutely infinitesimally small turnout, and the regime even was embarrassed by it. The boycott showed that people reject the sham differentiation between moderate and hardliner, and it was a blow to Khamenei and the regime. And of course, Raisi, as former Chief Justice of Iran and now President, we must never forget being a key player in the death commissions which massacred so many people, and whose leadership, therefore, no genuine freedom lover in Iran can ever trust. So what I want to say to you is this: no to the Shah, no to religious dictatorship, no to theocracy, and yes to democracy. However miserable people in Iran may from time to time be, I think you know that you can never afford to be, very easy for me to say, I know, ladies and gentlemen, that you can never afford to be anything other than optimists. Because unless you're optimistic, you probably won't try your very hardest. You just have to keep going. And it should just be underlined that our argument, the argument of my colleagues and friends today, is never with the people of Iran, but only with the rulers who deny you your birthright of freedom, democracy, and peace with justice. So however miserable you may be, remember you're not alone. You have friends. You have allies, you have cheerleaders all over the planet. You have people who, irrespective of race, of colour, of creed, of gender, of disability, or of orientation, will want to fly the flag of freedom in Iran. And to ensure that the flame of freedom burns brightly, it must never be extinguished. We've just got, those of us who share this passion for liberty, democracy, equality before the law and justice, to keep going on and on and on until, rather as in a war situation, we eventually show that our will for our decent values is greater than the will of the dictators and the despots and the tyrants for their perverted, twisted, bigoted, and inhumane values. So we will get there at the end. I'm very lucky to have been invited to speak to you. I mustn't push my luck, because the truth is, notwithstanding the quite extraordinary gracious welcome that you offered us all as we came in, and notwithstanding your unsurpassed courtesy and generosity of spirit, you will, my friends, as I sign off in support of you, be relieved to know that my speech is now definitively at an end. Thank you very much indeed.